Yo, this is me, Mike, Ringmaster of the Imagination Circus. I'm here to talk to you about something I've been wanting to talk about for a little while now, and that's the series The Witcher. And I'm not just talking about one facet of the franchise, I'm talking about the whole pie, the whole thing here. Sadly, I don't have any Witcher merchandise, but what can you do about that? Hopefully I'll have some Witcher merchandise that maybe I could put up here somewhere at some point. Like, I know, my display is a little all over the place, but anyway. Where to begin? Let's start with my journey as a fan of The Witcher. Where to begin? My first exposure to The Witcher was technically with the video games, even though I haven't actually played the games yet. I'm trying to do that right now. I won't necessarily go into that, but it was definitely after The Witcher 3 came out, but I think it was probably, not 2015, it wasn't 5 years ago, but it might have been 1 or 2 or even 3 years ago, that I came across one of the old trailers for the Witcher 3 video game, and I was intrigued. I really didn't have any context for it, but it looked really cool, and so that made me really curious, to be honest. And as a result, I became interested, so I started doing some research. I couldn't tell you exactly when I found out that there was going to be a show or that it was all based on a series of books, but it probably wasn't too long after discovering said trailer for the video game. Of course, at this point, I've gone through the books. I listened to them in an audiobook form. If you're interested, I would highly recommend it if you don't think you have the time, because there are 8 books. There are 8 books, and I went through all of them, and if you don't think you have the time for it, I would definitely suggest going through it in audiobook form, because it's like, if you want to go through it, actually read through all 8 books, it's going to take you a while, especially the last 2 books. Which is The Tower of the Swallow and Lady of the Lake. Those 2 books are particularly long. In audiobook form, they were 16 hours and 20 hours, respectively. And they're just, compared to the rest, I'm going to put a chart up here in editing. Again, so I'm imagining it right now as I record this for you guys. You guys are seeing it here. You're seeing it on YouTube as you watch the video itself. But let's say I'm putting up a chart here, or not even a chart, just a list saying with each of the books and their respective lengths in audiobook form. And as you can see, there's kind of a general, for the first 3 books in the main saga, they're not that far off. I don't remember exactly, again, because I don't know off the top of my head, but I do distinctly remember that the first 3 books in the 5-book Witcher saga were more or less 12 hours apiece, and then they suddenly got way longer with the last 2. I don't remember about the 2 short story collections or the prequel spin-off side novel, The Season of Storms. It's I gotta try to remember all these fantasy book names. It's a little hard. It's a little difficult. But yeah, so you can see, regardless, this is the case. And as such, if you feel like you don't have the time otherwise to just sit down and read these books, then I would say go ahead. So otherwise, I'd say I've become a really big fan of The Witcher. I do intend to play the trilogy of games by CD Projekt Red. I have the first 2 games downloaded off of Steam, but my operating software isn't compatible right now. So I'm going to be doing some stuff with my computer so that I can actually play them, because I'm the kind of person, I'm not a completionist when it comes to playing games. I've only ever 100%ed 2 games I've played in my life, and as such, but I do like, if it's part of a series, I do like to play all of the games in said series most of the time, and because I am a fan of The Witcher, I would like to play all of the games. So I'm going to get to that eventually, and of course, like I said, I went through the books. I think As far as the appeal goes, I think that I do like the short stories, at least from a premise site, a little bit more. But the whole 5 Witcher saga of books was fantastic, and the characters were great. The characters are definitely the biggest pull. Like, the world itself is really good and really well built. As far as fantasy world building is concerned, especially with especially when it comes to some of the political stuff, because I'm not necessarily super interested in those things, but I think that Sapkowski did a really good job when it came to those things. But it's all over the place. God, I'm trying to describe my feelings on this, but it's hard to really put it into words. I will say, like I said, the characters are definitely the biggest pull, though. I love them. Obviously, specifically the main 4 of Geralt, Ciri, Yennefer, and whenever I talk about him, whether I'm talking to a person about the character or I'm, like, in this case, making a video, the character of Jaskier or Dandelion or Dandelion, that one's a little weird because, okay, so from what I understand it, Jaskier is apparently it's the Polish word for a type of flower, like a honeysuckle or whatever. But in the English translated version of the books, at least with either version of the, like, because here's the thing. While the audiobook readings of the books was very good, like really good. Like they were read out by a guy named Peter Kenny. He read the books, he narrated the books, he did voices for all the characters, and he did a fantastic job doing it, including his voices for certain characters, like very distinct. When I think of, like, specifically 90% of the time when I think of Geralt's voice, it's his voice for Geralt that I'm thinking of. But but the thing is, like, outside of just having his name originally being Jaskier and being Jaskier in the Netflix show, the character is also called Dandelion or Dandelion, and in the books it kind of goes back and forth. And so the order in which I read the books was I read the Last Wish anthology short story collection. Then I read Season of Storms, because even though it's the most recent novel, it's actually set, like, in the middle of all of the other stories in The Last Wish. So I read that as my second purview into The Witcher. Then I got to Sword of Destiny, and then I went through the 5 main book saga. Maybe it was because I went with one of the latter books as my second read through, so to speak. The fact of the matter is that the way that his name was pronounced differently between those 2 versions, and so I always, because it was pronounced the first time I heard it as Dandelion in the first book, in that reading, I kind of like that I like that pronunciation more. It's unique, sounds a little less, let's go with the word thrilly. Thrilly. It's less thrilly sounding than Dandelion or whatever. I don't know. I like the way Dandelion sounds. But regardless, I never know what to call this character. But anyway, I think I more or less got my thoughts on the books out of the way, because I really like the books, and I'll probably talk about them more. But I'm going to talk about the Netflix show. Excuse me. I'm going to talk about the Netflix show now. So I guess I'll just start off by giving you my thoughts about it. I want to say that I actually really liked it. I enjoyed it. It made me very eager for more. I liked Henry Cavill. He definitely felt like he was being Geralt.
Go blood. Fuck.
And he's a huge fan of the series, of the franchise. He's read the books, he's played the games, so he's really into this stuff. And I think he did a really good job of being Geralt. Yeah, I don't think I have anything to complain about with his portrayal of the character. I feel like, you know, if even if he didn't play it like 100% accurate to the books, he did a really good job of just getting the idea of Geralt and the idea of being a Witcher across throughout the run of the show. That being said, I know that, like, there are those, and, like, again, I've heard mixed reviews concerning the show, both from fans and critics. I know that when it came out, like, a lot of the people watching the show seemed to be really into it, and that the critics just weren't into it. And, maybe I could kind of understand that, but when have critics ever really known what the hell they're talking about? I mean, come on. And in all honesty, I feel like the biggest issue with the series, at least as far as some are concerned, is probably the way they decided to go with this sort of... It was very linear storytelling, but the way they told the story, and I'll get into that, a little bit complicated. Now, since the show has come out, I've heard more stuff focused from people who have... been slightly more critical of the show, and most of the criticism I've heard tends to do with how it's different from the books, and I can understand that. There are a few changes that I'm, like, a little iffy on, and maybe really only, if I had to say, if I'm perfectly honest, I think there's only really one change in the show from the books that I really found that I disliked, and it's such a minor thing in the grand scheme of the story that I don't really think it matters all that much. And again, but then again, I've never been a very big purist when it comes to adaptations. I mean, sometimes I feel like you have to be a little bit more accurate, but for something like The Witcher and for the longer story that they're trying to tell, I don't really have a problem as much. As such, I guess I'll get into those changes and talking about my opinion about them. And like I said, I'm a big fan of... Because like I said, I actually like the show, and I thought they did a pretty good job with it. But I'm going to just kind of describe my thoughts about the show, and specifically about the differences from the book and my thoughts overall. I wrote some notes down in my phone here so that I as talking points. Alright, so first thing I want to talk about is, like, the stuff that they added that wasn't necessarily in the books, and that stuff is mostly concerned about Ciri and Yennefer. And the reason they did this, as I've heard it, I've watched, like, I've gone over some of the interviews, and I've seen, like, the cast talking about this stuff, and specifically from, I believe her name is Laura Hirsch, is the name of the showrunner, and the way she's talked about it, her opinion of the story from the books is very much about how Ciri, Yennefer, and Geralt become a sort of found family for each other. And I would agree that is definitely a huge, if not the most important focus from the books. It's probably like one of, if not one of the main focuses. As such, I'm more than okay with that being the thing that the show focuses on. Especially because I just love these characters, and I think all of the actors hired for these roles did a wonderful job. I suppose I should talk about spoilers. Like I said I'd talk about spoilers, and it'll primarily be about the show, but as such, because I'm comparing it to the books, I have to kind of bring up some things. Like I said, so I want to talk about the stuff about Ciri and Yennefer in the show. And what they ended up doing was they set the show throughout 3 different timelines, and the way that the showrunner, she described this as Ciri's story takes over a span of about 2 weeks, give or take a day or two. Geralt's about 30 years, and Yennefer's is something closer to, like, 90 years, maybe 80, I guess, because we don't really know, outside of Ciri, we don't really know how old Yennefer or Geralt are. So something along those lines when it comes to their character. It was probably closer to 70 in Yennefer's case, but I get the general idea. Because I know, because neither of them really age, and that's not immediately obvious, I would imagine, or at least I've heard that some people didn't really pick up on this when they first watched the show. I had heard about it beforehand, because I waited a little while until after I'd gone through the books to watch the show, but then there's also just the fact that because I'd gone through the books and knew a little bit more going in, I obviously had that context where I knew these things. So yeah, it didn't really, as a factor didn't really bother me so much. And when it comes to the fans, I've at least the people who like have read the books don't seem to have the problem with that. At least that's not their main problem with the show. The main problem with the show is how much stuff was changed from the books. As for what I'm super into when it comes to this stuff, like I said, they added stuff with Ciri and Yennefer, and with Ciri, it was mostly just about the sacking and the battle of Sintra, and how like Sintra was attacked by Nilfgaard. And because this is the case, they basically expanded on stuff that did happen in the books, but just wasn't focused on as much. And if you pay attention, there's clearly some stuff that they definitely altered from what happened in the books. But overall, it basically, like, if I were to describe the show as someone who actually likes it and compare it to the books, I would say that the show definitely follows the spirit of the books, if not the letter of the books, and I think that's okay. I think that's perfectly fine, especially with an adaptation like this, where you kind of have to make changes regardless. There are certain things you just can't do, and I think, and granted, there's probably some things that they could definitely have still done that they didn't for the show, but I'm okay with that. So the series stuff is, again, just an expansion on what happened during the Battle of Sintra, and then everything that happened to Ciri afterwards. All the stuff that happened to Ciri afterwards is kind of different from the books, but again, I think it works fine for what it is in the show. And to be perfectly honest, of the three storylines for the show, Ciri's was the least interesting to me, or at least everything that happened to her after we left Sintra was the least interesting part for me. And I don't think that's necessarily a problem overall, because no show is perfect, and I think that, like, the actress, even in the parts I wasn't particularly fond of, she did a really good job. So I'm going to give her props for that. And she's, like, I've heard, I think 17 or 18 probably at this point, I don't know. Which is about as old as Ciri ends up being at the end of the books, which, some people have a problem with, but she's fairly young looking, and thanks to that and the way they shot her, I think they worked it out pretty well. Her character in the show, based on one particular line from a character named East, she's apparently 12 in the show, and while the actress definitely doesn't look 12, I wouldn't say they made her where she doesn't actually look 17 either, so I think it's fine. When do people actually look their age? Am I right? Because, I know several people, and I know of several famous people as well, who just all don't look like as young or as old as they actually are, and so in this case, it just doesn't bother me as much. She physically looks like the character as described in the books, so that's more important to me. And that's something else to talk about as well, is just the description of the characters from the books. And because in the show, they went out of their way to, again, make specifically Ciri, Yennefer, and Geralt look like they're book characters, but everybody else is sort of all over the place. And to be fair, I think that's fair, considering the fact that after having gone through the books, they didn't really go into much detail about what most of the characters looked like in the books, so I don't think it matters much. Like, the one character I've heard people have gotten up in arms about looking different is Triss Merigold, and I understand why, but to be perfectly honest, if you're just talking about hair color, which is a stupid thing to get up in arms about to begin with, but if we're just talking about hair color, her hair in the books is described, a lot of people think that her hair should be red, super red, like in the video games. And yeah, her hair is super red there, but if you look at her description in the books, it's described a couple of times, and it's never described as being outright red the way it is in those game adaptations. But it's not really described as brown either. It's described more as a reddish brown auburn color. And somewhere in the middle between red and brown. And I think while the character so I think the way having the character and to be perfectly honest, outside of a few distinctions like Yennefer and Ciri and Geralt, having the character look exactly like their book counterpart doesn't really matter. Sometimes that stuff is far too hard to actually do, and in this case, while they probably could have found someone who looks perfectly like Triss, I feel like they captured the character pretty well for the show, at least based on my observations about her in the books. So I think that it's fine. Like, I don't think it really matters in her case. Like, the fact that they went out of their way to get people who could look like Yennefer and Ciri and Geralt, I think that's a little bit more important. And they went out of their way. I don't know about the actress who plays Ciri, but her eyes were definitely very green in the show, just like in the books. But unlike Geralt and Yennefer's actors, I don't know if the actress who played Ciri, and I think her eyes, I don't know if her eyes are naturally green or like with Yennefer and Geralt, they like had her wear contacts throughout the show. But if they did, then good on her for doing that, because I know granted, I'm not an actor, but if I were doing a film project, I'd be more than willing to act in said project, but I would probably not. I would not be able to wear. I wear glasses because I believe it's farsighted. I have problems with my distance vision. The farther something away, the blurrier it is. So, like, wearing contacts, though, the idea of wearing them bothers me. So, regardless, whether she wears contacts or not, good on Henry Cavill and Yennefer's actress, who I believe is Charlotta, something like that. I apologize. I feel like I should have remembered these. I wrote down the name of several other actors that are involved with the production of the show, but I didn't write down the main female leads' names. I didn't know if to what degree I was going to talk about them. The Yennefer stuff. All of the Yennefer stuff is alluded to or mentioned in the books. Like some people might disagree with me on that, but they basically expanded on with some of the few glimpses of backstory we got about the character, and I think they did a really good job with it. I think they did some interesting things with it that I wouldn't necessarily have thought of. For instance, the character of and again, some of these characters' names are hard to say, so I'm going to do my best though. Tessaya de Vries, I believe that's how that's pronounced, but Tessaya's character, of course, is present in the books, but she's not a character I didn't pay that much attention to. It's funny, she seems to become almost more important after she dies in the books, because she does die, unfortunately, in the books, and the weird thing about that, though, is that in the show, because she's much more of a focal character in the show, I like the version of her from the show a little bit more. And in hindsight, because of the show, I almost like the version of her from the books more now after having gone through and watched the show. So that's an interesting way to view things, but I think it is because she's just way more in focus. And in fact, I'd say there are actually a couple of characters that I actually like more in the show, or at the very least are more focused on, and therefore I like them a little bit more because we get pay a little bit more attention to them here than we did in the books. For instance, another character that I think got this treatment and became way more likable as a result was the character of Eastrid. Now, Eastrid in the books only shows up in one of the short stories from the Sword of Destiny short story collection, and that story, which is one of the ones that they didn't adapt for the first season, but I'll talk about that also a bit because I have some thoughts about how they're going to go with Season 2, but when it comes to Eastrid in the books, he only appears in a story called A Shard of Ice. And it's the second short story within the Sword of Destiny short story collection, and it's pretty important because it's the story where Geralt and Yennefer break up for the second time. And the part of the reason that they break up is because, well, at this point in their relationship, I love Geralt and Yennefer's relationship, but I will admit that the reason they never worked, at least up until the end of the series, where they seem to have worked out most of their issues, if not all of them, is what I would say is basically on them. It's pretty much entirely their own fault that they can't seem to make a relationship work. But in this case, part of the reason their relationship ends is because apparently Yennefer slept with Eastrid while being in a relationship with Geralt. And again, it's I wouldn't say it's brushed under the rug, but it's kind of like put to the wayside as far as the problems go. Obviously, it bothers Geralt because it should, and Yennefer, but Yennefer is not exactly like feeling like 100% about this. By the end of the book, she ends up cutting off contact with both of them, and that's how Geralt's relationship ends, and at least with Yennefer the second time. And I find that very interesting because it's probably my least favorite story, so I'm kind of glad they didn't adapt it in the show, but it's probably my least favorite story in the entire series, really, just because of how it paints the picture of Geralt and Yennefer's relationship, and because I'm rooting for them to be together, it kind of, that doesn't ruin that for me, but it doesn't, being with the subject matter, it's not really something I'm particularly fond of. But when it comes to the character of Eastrid in that story, he wasn't a character, he wasn't the worst. I mean, of all the sorcerers in the books, he wasn't the worst, but it's definitely where his character is, like, you don't really feel anything super positive, if you can call it positive at all, but until the end of the story, because it's essentially implied. I mean, I'm pretty sure this is what it's meant to imply, but it's essentially implied that he's, like, him and Geralt are going to have a duel, and it's a duel over Yennefer. Yennefer, who has essentially broken it off with both of them and just leaves town without saying goodbye to either of them. And they're going to have a duel. And it's heavily implied that both Geralt and Eastrid are trying to commit suicide. In Geralt's case, because he was going to fight a wizard, and Geralt, while strong as a witcher, would probably, a few times we've seen him fight a magic user, he usually doesn't do very well. I mean, there's really only one good example of that in the books, but he doesn't do very well in those cases. Regardless of that, though, it's implied that they're both trying to kill themselves, because Eastrid, when it comes to the duel, he comes with a sword, and he's apparently going to duel not using magic, so it's very heavily implied that he's trying to kill himself. And, based on that little bit from the books, and based on what they did with Eastrid in the show, I can see that. If they had gone and done a Shard of Ice as a story, I can totally see that happening. And, the way they handled Eastrid's character in the show. But with the way they handled Eastrid's character in the show, he became way more likable. Like I said, with Tessaya DeVries, it's like, she's in the books more than Eastrid is, but at the same time, she also is so out of focus that it was more like I kind of became sad when it came to her character by the end of the books, because they kept bringing her up so often and why she was important for so many of these sorceresses. But in the books, I still didn't feel too strongly about her, but with the show, it kind of reinforced those small feelings I already had, and made me like her character way more. And as a result, I became way more fond of that character in retrospective. And something similar happened with Eastrid, where Eastrid, we get to spend more time with him in the show. We get to see him and Yennefer's relationship and how they met, and to the point where he even cared about her before she changed her appearance and became beautiful. And it really reinforces the fact that it almost makes it like, it's like I was thinking, oh man, I really hope they can work things out. And then I almost did a mental double take where I'm like, wait, no, I want her to end up with Geralt. What the hell am I thinking? It's weird. It's weird because in the books he comes off initially as a real jerk, almost a douchebag in a way, because he's just so rude to Geralt, and he's so and most of the sorcerers are jerks in one way or another, but Eastrid was a weird case because he had this huge connection with Yennefer and by extension Geralt. And then by the end of the book, you feel bad for him more than anything else. Even if you probably still don't like him in the books. At least I certainly didn't. But by the end of it, I felt sorry for him at least. But in the show, they make him a genuinely likable character. And you can see that he's not he's not trying to be a bad guy, but because he's working directly under Stregobor, who they gave way more attention to in the show than I would have ever thought of, but okay. But yeah, it was weird. It was very weird. So I liked Eastrid a lot more in the show. Let's see, but then there are just some of the other changes. Like I said, because the Yennefer and Ciri stuff is essentially just expand. Unlike the Geralt stuff, where the Geralt stuff is all essentially adaptations of different stories from the books. Like, not all of it 100%, but 90% of the stuff in the show about Geralt is from the books. The stuff about Yennefer and Ciri is also from the books, but it's never in focus the way it is in the show, and as such, the writers had a little bit more free reign with those characters, which is why when you look at, while Geralt does have an arc in the show, it's not as clear or as solid or obvious as with Ciri and Yennefer, because they essentially put that together from scratch in the show, the writers, and I'm more than okay with that because it adds a little bit more. And while my initial reaction to some of the Yennefer stuff was that doesn't quite fit with what I thought from the books, I realized that not only was what they did in the show better than what I thought from the books, but also, books are very much written, the good ones at least in my opinion, a lot of the time they leave things up to interpretation from the readers, especially when it comes to descriptions, or just anything that's too vague to be 100% obvious. So when it comes to Yennefer's stuff in the books, I feel like I can definitely imagine the stuff that happened in the show being the exact representation for the books, if I ever go back to the books, and I probably will at some point. The series stuff, again, I'm a little bit more iffy about. Everything that happens in Sintra is good, I love that stuff, but everything that happens afterward is a little bit more But speaking of some of those, let's just talk about the changes, specifically the changes to certain stories. Let's start with just the first episode, just so I could get a couple things out of the way. Now, in the first episode, while we do follow, Yennefer doesn't even appear in the first episode, we're just following Ciri and Geralt, but you can tell that time, I picked up on this right away, but that's only because I was paying way too close attention and was pausing the show every 3 or 5 minutes just to analyze some of the stuff that was happening on screen, comparing it to the books, all other knowledge I had from other sources. So when it comes to the stuff that from just the first episode of the show, it's funny because it's definitely not bad. Obviously not bad, at least as far as I'm concerned. But they changed it. So the first episode of the show, at least the stuff with Geralt, is mostly an adaptation of The Lesser Evil, which is one of the stories from the Last Wish collection, in which Geralt goes to a town after having slayed a Kikimora, and he's just going there to stay for a couple of days and maybe get some food and rest. Take a very short break from witchering. And he wants to sell this Kikimora, and I believe the term they use is arbiter of the town, but the arbiter of the town won't take it. So what ends up happening is Geralt ends up trying to sell it to the wizard, Stregobor. Now, in both the show and the book, the character of Stregobor is using an alias at the time because someone is trying to kill him. Specifically, the character of Renfrey in both versions of the story, who is a princess who's had a very, very difficult life because of Stregobor. And it's kind of a weird situation because it's a really good story in both the books and the adaptation, but there are a couple of minor changes. I don't want to talk about. I mean, I could go through the whole thing and just tell you my thoughts on all of these stories in both versions, but that's not what I'm trying to do right now. I'm trying to talk about the minor differences between the two and why I don't really see them as a problem. For instance, in the books, Geralt has been to the town. It's called the town of Blaviken, and he's been to Blaviken before in the books, but this is the first time he's he's been there in like about 2 years. And so he already knows the Arbiter and is in fact staying with him in the books. And so because like Geralt already knows the Arbiter and initially tries to sell the Kikimora to him in the books. But in the show, not only does he not know the Arbiter and has not been to Blaviken before, but like he doesn't actually even meet with the Arbiter. He meets with the Arbiter's daughter, who is kind of mentioned in the books, but is such a minor character that we barely hear about her. And as such, she's his connection to the town throughout the episode. And I like her. She's definitely a good addition. I like her about the same as I liked her father in the books, so I would say she's a good addition. She's definitely cuter, obviously. A little girl, like, you know, feels sympathy for a child, so it works out in the way that they did it in the show. But that's just one of the differences, and it's such a minor difference, but there's a couple other things, like one, for instance, once Geralt gets to Stragobor's tower, like, the description in the books and in the show is just obviously a little different. There's some stuff that I think, not that they couldn't have done, but just that they thought it would have, maybe they couldn't have pulled it off and made look as good or as interesting or as believable as described in the books. So they went a little less outlandish with it, like at least when it came to the description of the interior. There were a couple of other changes, obviously, from that scene. Okay, so this is not a big deal. I don't care, obviously, and I'd say this is definitely something to blame on Game of Thrones. But, so, in the books, there is one naked girl described in that scene. In the show, I didn't count, there were definitely more than 5, I'd be willing to say. There were definitely more than 5 naked girls in that scene in the show. And, you know what, all I'll say is, I'm not bothered by it. I'm not against a bunch of naked girls, but I also say it's I will say, all I'm saying is that of all of the things to add to that scene, adding more than one naked girl probably a bit unnecessary. I don't know who is responsible for that change. What I will say is it probably emphasizes a couple of things, maybe about Stregobor specifically. I don't know. It's a weird thing, but I'm going to call it a Game of Thrones effect in that, you know what, you want something to sell? Add a little bit of sexiness. Add some naked people to entice your audience a little bit. And so why not? I don't know. It simply doesn't bother me. I just think it was a weird, unnecessary change to make. One of the other changes, again, in this very scene, in fact, is that Stregobor and Geralt don't know each other, because it's described that in the books they met in the past. I don't remember exactly where they'd met before, but they had met before. And as such, like with Geralt not having a connection to Blaviken before this episode, he also has just never met Stregobor before. Stregobor before. But because that is the case, it's not a big deal, but it does change the things up a little bit when it comes to this scenario, but not in a way where it really alters the story all that much. I think we get to some of the bigger changes, because there are a few bigger ones that occur later down the line with the show. Specifically, something like, say, the fact that when it comes to the Brokilon storyline. So, Brokilon is kind of important in the books, in a sense that we go there more than once, and that it has a significant effect on the relationship between Ciri and Geralt, in that it's where they first meet in the books. And it's also where Geralt recovers after some severe injuries that he gets. Geralt gets severely beaten, has to take a few weeks, I think, and maybe even a month or so, but he spends some time recovering in Brokilon Forest. Now, Brokilon is the home of the Dryads. If I were to choose how to say it, and I don't mind, I don't necessarily, like I said, it's meh to me at worst, but the Brokilon stuff in the show was the part that I found not necessarily disappointing, but just not as interesting as it was in the books. Just because, and this is important. One, Geralt never goes there in the show, at least not yet. He's probably still been there at some point, because maybe he hasn't, but I wouldn't be surprised, because that would be a weird change to make if he had. Then again, he says they did that with Blaviken, but that doesn't really matter. That didn't affect that story. Wouldn't really affect this story either. But it's where Geralt and Ciri first meet, and therefore form their initial relationship. And because they removed Geralt from that part of the story, for reasons I understand, because I was a little iffy about that at first, but after thinking about it and what they decided to do with the show, I'm more than okay with it. Some people feel that, like, you know, they shouldn't have taken that out, and don't get me wrong, I would be very happy if they had kept that in. But there are a couple of reasons why they couldn't have. Because they decided to do the series, yeah, they decided to jump around a bit with the timelines, and specifically with the three characters and their timelines in relation to each other. But the show is pretty much, if not entirely, linear. With a few exceptions, the show is told in order. If they had gone and done Geralt and Ciri meeting for the first time in Brokilon, in which case she then goes back to Sintra before the Nilfgaardian attack, I think that would have, like, slowed down the pace of the entire series too much. And I believe the exact words of the showrunner was that if they had gone and done that particular storyline, they wouldn't have actually been fully introduced to Ciri until season 2, or something like that, and it was a little confusing, but I think the gist of it was, because they decided to tell the story the way they did, and because it would take a lot of time to get to Geralt and Ciri's meeting as it happened at the end of Sword of Destiny, and at the end of the show. Initially, she meets Geralt there, and that's important for a number of reasons. It forms their relationship. He doesn't even know who she is yet. She, I think, has some idea. Again, it's been a little while since I went through the books, but she has some idea, but, like, she doesn't entirely know the details about it. I think she knows even less in the show, actually, but regardless, there are a couple of reasons why I don't think that would have worked in the show. One, they of course, like I said, like, the actress playing Ciri is, like, 17, but she's playing, like, a 12-year-old, and I don't think that's a problem, but the character in the books at that time would have been about 8 or 9, and because that's the case, I feel like the actress and even just the character might be a little too old to do those scenes from the book, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because I don't think, while those scenes are important, I think what will make the difference, because like I said, I don't care about too many of the changes in the show. I think the show is good. I think it does a good representation of the world of The Witcher, and as such, compared to something, you know, like the books already exist. The books are good on their own. We don't really need a 100% accurate adaptation of those events. What we got was not only really good, but they did a pretty good job of adapting stuff from the books that they chose to adapt, and they didn't need to be 100% accurate. So I'm mostly okay with that part of them, like, altering the Brokilon storyline. And really, how I feel about them removing the Ciri Geralt stuff from Brokilon in the show depends entirely on how they handle the characters' relationship and their interactions in Season 2. Because what I want to see is a little bit of what we saw in that Brokilon story in the books. A little bit of it, and I want to see some of it essentially done in the show. Now, speaking of which, since I brought this up anyway, I'll bring up my one major gripe with the first season, and then I'll move on to what I want to talk about, the stuff that's probably going to happen in Season 2. So, in the show, specifically when it comes to Geralt and Yennefer's relationship, I think it was good. I think it made sense for what it was, because they're trying to... if I were to describe what the showrunners and the writers and everybody in the Witcher show on Netflix were trying to do, was streamline the story from the books. They were trying to take what happened in the books, and they were trying to not necessarily have it happen fast, but just streamlining the story, trimming the fat, as it were. Which is why, instead of having Geralt and Yennefer having been, then they could have done this, but but because of the way they did, I really don't have an issue with how they did it in the show, because it accomplishes the same thing that happened in the books. So the big difference here is that Geralt and Yennefer in the books are essentially in a relationship for about a year, where Geralt stays and lives with Yennefer in Vendenberg, and you know they're in a relationship, and they're together for about a year. But by the end of that, Geralt just up and leaves, kind of without notice, And we never really get a full explanation for why, but by the end of it, it's clear that he, like, regrets it, or at least he feels he made a mistake later on when it came to doing that. He apologizes for that. Time we catch up with them and have them meet again, in both the show and the books, it's in the story The Bounds of Reason. Now, in the show, the episode was called Rare Species. Now, in the show, what is implied to have happened is that a couple of years have passed since they first met, and they were never in a long-term relationship together, but they keep meeting up and essentially sleeping together. And that works more or less the same as far as I'm concerned. I think it fits pretty well. And in The Bounds of Reason and in Rare Species, we see them meet up again after a while, and they end up going on a dragon hunt together. Now, Geralt apparently, like, it's not as emphasized as much in the show, but apparently in the books, Geralt, as a witcher, apparently has something of a code when it comes to killing dragons. And I don't remember how much of it is just a Geralt thing and how much of it is a Witcher thing, but I think it's mostly a Witcher thing. That they apparently do not kill dragons. But everybody else that is in this party are trying to kill this dragon and are trying to take its dragon hoard of gold and jewels. And that kind of doesn't become a thing by the end of the story because of a number of reasons, but by the end of it, Geralt and Yennefer get back together. And something like that happens in the show, where they kind of become a full-on item here. They finally fully admit their feelings for each other and express their thoughts when it comes to this stuff. And of course, they bicker, which is definitely a Geralt-Yennefer staple, and I kind of enjoy that about their relationship. I don't know, I find it very entertaining. But by the end of it, instead of staying together and then, like, breaking up in a shard of ice, which is, again, like I said earlier in the video, my least favorite story from the entire series, in my opinion. But in the show, what they do is they streamline this by having Geralt and Yennefer break up, like, right as before the episode ends. And the reason they do this is the one major change from the books that if they'd done it a different way, then I wouldn't have cared as much. The fact that they break up does not bother me, because that happens in the books, and that's an important stage in their relationship where they kind of have to deal with some of their own shit. But the problem I have is specifically with the reason why they break up, and it's because of the way Yennefer, the difference in her reaction to Geralt's last wish. No, we don't know exactly what the hell the wish is. The titular last wish, we do not know what the hell that wish is. His first two wishes were essentially to tell the genie to go off, and then second wish was to have that one guy burst, and they didn't really emphasize the first wish in the episode, in the show, but it was the same thing, essentially. They just didn't cover it, which I'm a little sad about that, if only because in the books it was really, really funny the way it went, which is the kind of stuff I'd expect from Sapkowski. But you know what? They gave us different funny stuff in the show, and so I'm cool with it, because you know what? If you're going to change the funny stuff from one thing in an adaptation and then give your audience different funny stuff as a substitute, and I was more than happy with the funny stuff. One of my favorite jokes from the entire run of the show was in that episode, and it's literally the part where Jaskier asks Geralt what he thinks of his singing.
Oh, we are so having this conversation. Come on, Geralt, tell me, be honest. How's my singing?
And Geralt goes, "It's like ordering a pie and finding that it has no filling." And not only is Jaskier's reaction great, but just the way that that's very, very clever wording, and it's very well thought out. It's a good joke, in my opinion. I really liked that. And if anything, it sets up another joke by the end when Jaskier is mourning for Geralt. He alters history a bit there. I thought that was very funny. But the thing I dislike is specifically, like I said, the last wish is, we don't know what it is, but whatever it is, it saves Yennefer's life from the djinn, which was definitely going to kill her. Whatever it is Geralt wished for saved her life. Now, In the books, she considers it sweet and finds out what it is right away before they sleep together for the first time, which happens a little bit differently, but the contexts are basically the same in that case. But in the show, she doesn't find it out, but in the book, she finds out right away, and she's actually touched by this wish. And it's actually a really sweet scene, all things considered, which is ironic, at least in my case, because it cuts right to them getting busy, and then it goes from sweet to funny very quickly in the books, but it kind of does that in the show, so they got the tone right at least. But she doesn't find out what the wish is in the show, and in the episode Rare Species, which is based on the Bounds of Reason, she of course ends up finding out. It is technically, because Geralt still doesn't say what the hell the wish is actually for, and so Yennefer, if anything, is having this, and granted, her reaction is not without reason. Like, the Yennefer of the books is a little bit different in that she found it sweet, but in that case, she actually knew the exact nature of the wish, and I wouldn't be surprised if the wish was a little bit different, even though in both cases we don't know what it is. But in the show, Yennefer, very, very justified, mind you, as a character, as a person, her reaction to this reacts as though the only reason Geralt and her keep running into each other is because of the wish, and that whether their feelings might not even be real because of the wish. And I understand what she's saying, because that's a very legitimate concern. I don't think that's the case. I don't think that's remotely what actually is going on. But I understand it's a very understandable concern on her part. But because I'm so invested in their love story throughout the series, the idea that she has this different reaction from the books is the only change from the first season of the show that I actually have a real problem with. All the other changes were so minute that it did not bother me. None of the other ones, because the reason it doesn't bother me is because when I heard the show was happening, I was like, oh, I was very excited, but wasn't super concerned about how accurate it was going to be, because the books already exist, and the books are good on their own. They don't need to have their stories retold exactly in a new medium. But I was just happy to see these characters and these stories being told at all, and I thought the way they were told was fairly well done in the show. It's just this one change with Yennefer's reaction, but I understand why they did it, and because I like the way the characters went overall in the show, and some very good stuff happened with it, from just Istrid's reaction, because Istrid's reaction of Yennefer essentially going back to him in a rebound sort of situation after she breaks up with Geralt is not only very real, but his reaction is so legit. Like, this girl that I like in college, we have this huge argument because we both did something. We kind of went behind each other's back. We didn't cheat on each other, but we betrayed each other's trust mutually, and we both get pissed about it. And then we break up, and we don't see each other for years. And by the time she comes back to me, I've changed as a person for a number of reasons. I've essentially achieved my dream. I've got my dream job. I used to pine over her for so long. I wanted to find a way to get closer to her so that we could be in a relationship again. But at this point, I've not only gotten the job I wanted, but I'm in a better place in my life, and I know this relationship wasn't really healthy, and I'm still not 100% over how the relationship ended to begin with. So I decide that I don't want to get back together with this girl. And I think that's a fairly legit reaction, because at this point, Istrid, I don't think, clearly doesn't know about Yennefer and Geralt and the fact that he's essentially a rebound for her in this scene. But the fact of the matter is that that's what he is, and so not only is his reaction very much legit, but it's pretty much justified. Like, girl, you chose to do something that I don't really agree with. And, so I'm afraid that for me, it's too late. We had our chance. It's over. I have some thoughts about this, because apparently Istrid is coming back for season 2, and so I have some thoughts about that. Okay, so let me just lay down what I thought was going to happen with the show when I first heard about it. The show is based on the first two books in the Witcher series, those being The Last Wish and The Sword of Destiny. And of the short stories that they adapt, they only did 8 episodes, so they adapted in order, in chronological order. They adapted The Lesser Evil, The Edge of the World, The Last Wish, A Question of Price, The Witcher, The Bounds of Reason, The Sword of Destiny, and something more. They only adapted 8 out of 13 short stories. So the other 5 short stories are basically a grain of truth and the voice of reason, a shard of ice, and then there's Eternal Flame, a little sacrifice. They didn't adapt all these short stories. Now, the way I thought the show was going to go was I thought that they were going to as I heard about, like, because I read the Wikipedia article about the show, and it basically tells you which episodes are based on what short stories. And having read that and then watching the show, I assumed for a little bit that they were going to adapt the first season the way they did, and then they were going to do season 2 where it would be almost immediately be the Blood of Elves. That's what I thought they were going to do. I thought season 2 was going to be entirely made up of the Blood of Elves storyline. But based on the way that, based on what I've heard, based on one thing, I no longer think that. And there were some things that I wanted specifically to happen for season 2. Specifically, I wanted them, because I thought they were going to go directly into the Blood of Elves, what I wanted them to do was I wanted them to just show Ciri and Geralt traveling together to Kaer Morhen, and I wanted them to, bond and actually, show, I wanted the series to show them actually interacting and becoming closer as they traveled to Kaer Morhen. And I think they might still do that. I think they might do that come the beginning of season 2. But based on a recent thing that I've heard, specifically some casting I've heard of, that I'm actually pretty excited for, and when it comes to season 2, it makes me very interesting. So they've cast a couple of specific actors for specific ones that I think are very important. Let me just start off with this guy. Let me see. So this is a real person's name that I'm trying to pronounce, and this person is Norwegian, so I'm going to try and pronounce his name as best I can, but please bear with me because I don't know how well this is going to do. Christopher Hivju. Okay, Christopher Hivju, probably most famously at this point in his career for playing Tormund Giantsbane on Game of Thrones, will be playing Nivellen in season 2 of The Witcher. And the reason this is important is because Nivellen only featured in one Witcher story. One of my favorites, if not my favorite, at least from the short story collection, that I was a little disappointed to not see adapted into season 1. But if they're doing this in season 2, I'm hyped for this. They appear, based on this, and the fact that they also cast one Agnes Bjorn. I think I'm saying her last name right. There's an accent over the O in the name, but I believe it's Agnes Bjorn. She's playing a character called Verena, and these two characters only appear in one Witcher story called A Grain of Truth, and if they bring them into an episode in season 2, it means that it has to mean, because if they're featuring both of these characters, it means they're doing an adaptation of A Grain of Truth. And I am okay with this on so many levels because I love that particular short story so much. It's probably the one I like. It might be my favorite of the short stories. It might even be my favorite Witcher story, period. But I love A Grain of Truth. So the fact that they're doing an adaptation, and the fact that Christopher Hivju is playing Nivellen, I am so on board for that. I am so on with this. I love that, and I can. And do I seem really hyped for this? Because I am. I really am, and because that's the case. Because that is the case, the thing is that that raises some interesting questions about season 2. So these two are obviously new actors that have been added to the cast along with a few others, but these are the two that I was the most interested in because of who they were playing. But the thing is, no other characters from any of the other short stories that they adapted were brought up. Now, in the case of some of those, there's one say The Shard of Ice, which they could theoretically adapt. There would be some issues with it for a number of reasons, but they could theoretically adapt A Shard of Ice into the show. It would be weird because of the timeline. It would make the timeline of the show even more different, because I haven't really talked about that, but the timeline of the show is definitely different from the books in at least one major way. But, in the book, therefore, there's no Ciri. There's also no Yennefer. He hasn't met Jaskier or Dandelion yet. So, because that's the case, I'm wondering how, if they're doing this, how they're going to handle it. Because are they going to have it be a flashback, which I'm kind of okay with, but is it going to be another case where they're going to be going a little out of order and therefore can do this, having this story be set at an earlier time in the timeline? I don't know. Maybe. It's a little weird, so I don't really know. But then there's if they decided to go a different route with it, and if they decided to do what I suggested to you guys, if they had Ciri and Geralt journeying together to Kaer Morhen, and on their way there, they essentially did a grain of truth and had Ciri be a part of the story, I think that could work if they decided to go that route. I think adding Ciri to a grain of truth wouldn't really change it that much. Really, the only thing that would Ciri wouldn't have that big of an effect on what happens in the story, but she would at least be interesting. It would be very entertaining if she was part of the conversation that Geralt had with Nivellen, because Geralt's conversation with Nivellen is kind of the best part of that story, and so having Ciri be a part of that conversation would actually be pretty cool, and I would be kind of okay with that if they decide to go that route. Especially if, like I said, they did it while also having just Geralt and Ciri bond on the way to Kaer Morhen. So I'm more than okay with this. I'm just really don't know how they're going to do this, when it comes to the timeline of events that they've established in the show. That being the case, this raises a couple of questions, because these are the only two prominent actors that have been mentioned that have been cast for Season 2 that have been named as characters from some of the other short stories that, happened in the first two books. And there are a couple of other stories. For instance, they don't appear, at least I haven't seen anything that would suggest they're going to be adapting A Little Sacrifice, which is another one of my favorites. They don't need to adapt it, obviously, but the fact that they're adapting a grain of truth, outside of me just liking it, raises a lot of questions about what they're going to be doing for the rest of Season 2. Because are they going to have Geralt and Ciri travel to Kaer Morhen and bond as they go, and then have a grain of truth just happen along the way? Are they going to get it? And I mentioned that I initially thought they were going to start adapting Blood of Elves right away at this point. And they could technically still do that. They would just have to start a little bit later in the season, or maybe even, maybe they wouldn't start I don't know. I honestly don't know. It's mind-blowing, because it's what are they going to do? I thought I knew what they were going to be doing. I thought they were going to essentially do a single book in the main series for the rest of the timeline throughout, do a season per book for the rest of the main books in the series. But at this point, I guess I'm wrong, because they're apparently adapting A Grain of Truth. So I don't know what's happening anymore. But you know what? I'm kind of okay with that, because I like surprises when it comes to my storytelling. I like being surprised. I like not being able to figure things out, because it gives something a little bit more gravity when you don't necessarily see it coming. And I'm pretty good at predicting things when it comes to storytelling. So this threw me a bit of a curveball. So I'm kind of happy about that. But before there are a couple of other things when it comes to season 1 that I do want to talk about. Specifically when it comes to certain characters. Vilgefortz we were introduced to in season 1, and I have a couple things to say about him. He was one of the characters who my perspective was sort of shifted. Not shifted, because my feelings about him in the books hasn't really changed, but the way they did him in the show is interesting for a couple of reasons. Vilgefortz shows up, literally, he like goes up to Yennefer right after Eastrid, yeah, he goes, and Vilgefortz, you can actually see him in the background observing the two of them, observing their conversation before Eastrid leaves and he goes up to Yennefer, so it's well set up in the show. But he comes over, introduces himself, and the minute I hear his name, I'm like, oh shit, I did not expect to see you this soon in the show. But okay, and from the minute we're introduced to him in the show, I'm like, okay, I was a little iffy because they seem to be making him a little too likable. And if you know Vilgefortz in the books, at least in my opinion, he's kind of the main villain of the book series, in my opinion. And because if I were to compare his two characters, so here's the thing: by the last time we see Vilgefortz, at the end of the first season, during the Battle of Sodden, in the show, we spend most of our time with Vilgefortz during this battle, where we see some of his sword skill, because he's a sorcerer, but he's unique both in the show and the books for being a badass when it comes to combat. Unlike most sorcerers who are only really good at magic, he's good at both. He's shown to be just as much of a badass in the show as he is in the books. The problem is, or it's not even a problem, it's just I found this very interesting. So in the show, he comes off like he's trying to help Yennefer. And he recruits her and brings her, and it's why she ends up being one of the mages who fights during the Battle of Sodden, like in the books. And this is how they explain it in the show. But with Vilgefortz, I was wondering, well, he's coming off as a really nice guy here. He's coming off as way more charming than the books. Because in the books, we're shown, well, I don't think we're shown Vilgefortz, personality right away when we're introduced to him, because I don't think that chapter or that section was from his points of view. It's been a while since I went through it, so I don't remember. But at the very least, we had a perspective on his character, and we knew he was a villain in the books, right away. And he always came when he was interacting with other characters, and he was pretending to be like a normal person, essentially like a cordial, polite, nice guy in the books. It always came off to me like he was very slimy. He was the slimy kind of charming. Like, he acts very charming, but he's a very slimy guy. And he's meant to be very good-looking initially, so I would say that the actor they got to hire him is not only perfect for that, as he did a really good job playing Vilgefortz as a little bit more, not only is he appropriately good looking, but he's also just appropriately he's a lot better actually than the book character when it comes to actually pretending to be a nice guy. Because in the books, like I said, I consider, because we have a couple of antagonists in the books, but I would consider him to be the main villain, the main antagonist of the books. And because of that, when I saw how nice they made him in the show and how he seemed to be a nice guy, I thought, okay, if you can change all this other stuff, I don't care about any of the other changes except that one I already mentioned that I thought was a problem. Books, like when it came to Vilgefortz in the show and in the books, I was like, okay, in the show, I was watching him the whole time, and I'm like, okay, you better not be this nice. You better not be because granted, I wasn't that worried about it, but at the same time, I was just a little bit concerned because of all the things to change. They'd already made okay, in the books, I always thought it was Fringilla, but in the show, I think they pronounce it Fringilla, or maybe that's reversed and it's the other way around. Either way, they change her character a lot in the show, and they make her one of the antagonists, and I'm okay with that, because she wasn't super important in the show, in the books, in a way that really it matters now that she's the fact that they made this change. But because they made that change with her character, I thought maybe with Vilgefortz they were going to make him a nice guy now. and I thought maybe they were reversing those roles, and I was like, oh, thank God, because by the end, the last time we see Vilgefortz, he wakes up after getting knocked unconscious after he has a fight with Kair. And he goes, and there's this guy among one of his own people, it would seem, who's dying slowly from a wound he got, and he picks up what, like a warhammer or a mace. I don't remember what the weapon was, but he hits him in the head. And you could misconstrue it where the first blow, you think maybe he's trying to put this guy out of his misery. But then he hits him again, and I think even a third time, and you're like, okay, those extra swings kind of overkill, literally and figuratively, and it's like, okay, yeah, you're definitely still the character, or at least based on that one act, you appear to still be the character from the books, in which case, thank you. I really didn't want him to turn out to be a nice guy, because in the books, he is so duplicitous and disgusting and horrible and mental. I hated him so much in the books. So if they made him, like, I appreciate giving us, like, a mystery for those of us who don't know about the books and don't know that he turns out to be such a scumbag. But because of the way they did it, I was a little concerned that he was going to turn out to be a nice guy, and I was really happy when it at least appeared. Because and they did this on purpose, obviously, because they wanted it to be a little bit mysterious, wanted it to be a little bit unclear for those who are not a little bit more uninitiated than those who've gone through the books, like myself and others out there. They did this to essentially throw off so many people when it came to Vilgefortz's character, and to build a mystery for people to solve. Or maybe they'll just admit it in Season 2 right away when we first see Vilgefortz again and admit that he's really an asshole. And I'm okay with that either way, because he is an asshole, and I just, obviously I hate his character, but he's the kind of character I'm very happy to hate because he's that much of an asshole, but he works as a villain because of that, and because of a couple of other things that he does in the book. So I'm almost happier that they made him so charming and almost likable initially when he's first introduced in the show, because that way he comes off as almost more effective as a bad guy by pretending to be so cool and so likable. There was one other thing I wanted to talk about, and this is such a minor thing compared to everything else I talked about, but it's something that I wanted to bring up just because I thought it was funny. And I don't know if you guys will find it funny too, but I thought this was hilarious, to be honest. Mahesh Judu, or I don't know how to pronounce his name, his last name especially. Is it Jadu or Jadu? You know what I mean? It's hard to say. Mahesh Judu and one Erman Farron, respectively. Much easier name to pronounce when it comes to Kair's actor. But when it came to these two actors, here's the funny thing. This is just a little anecdote of mine that I wanted to say, talking about this. So, when it came to Vilgefortz and Kair in the show versus their book counterparts, when it came to their appearances, I more or less, when I first saw Vilgefortz, like, I didn't initially realize that the character, like, it wasn't until, like, because it occurred to me we'd probably seen him, I think he was the one who killed King East during the battle, like the initial battle of Sindra in the open field. I think that Kair might have been the one to do it, because we see he's an archer later when he kills, God, I don't even remember, that one knight who was meant to protect Ciri, when they're riding away, like, at the end and trying to get away, and Kair, like, very briefly captures her. So in the show, like once I realized that was Kair, I'm like, not exactly how I imagined him to look in the books, but that's fine. It's like, like, outside of Geralt, Ciri, and Yennefer, I don't think it matters. But when we get to Vilgefortz was introduced, my initial reaction, like I said, was, oh shit, this is Vilgefortz. He is way nicer than I thought he would be. And I wasn't expecting to see him this soon. But a secondary thought I had when I especially because we see him fight Kair later like an episode or so later, we see the two of them fight, and I'm like, wait a minute. Okay, so the gist of this story is this. Because I know I tend to ramble on and take a while to get to the point, but the point is this. Kair, for me, is essentially what I imagine Vilgefortz to look like, and Vilgefortz is what I imagine Kair to look. They basically look the way I imagined the other two look when I was going through the books. Like, because we don't exactly get a very in-detail description for either of them, it was a little vague, it didn't really give all that much detail. When I imagined these two characters, this is what I imagined either of them to look like. That I thought it was just kind of funny. But anyway, yeah, I think I covered everything about The Witcher in general that I wanted to talk about. So, in that case, yeah, I hope you guys enjoy that. I hope you all, I might do some more Witcher stuff in the future, so I hope you look forward to that. But anyway, this is Mike, Ringmaster of the Imagination Circus, and I hope that you guys enjoyed this. I hope you had a good time, and I hope that you might come back and visit me again in the future. Thank you, and have a good day.